Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Parker Palmer has a quote that says, people don't start movements because they hate an institution, but because they love it so much that they don't want it to descend to its lowest level. And really, that's my heart. It's like the institution church is the jar of clay, and we have this treasure inside, and there's so much that the clay is getting in the way of the message. How do we let the treasure be the treasure beyond the walls of the church and not let the institutional part of church? Like, I really do love the church. I don't want to get emotional, but I do. I love the church, but I think this clay jar is what's getting in the way. And if it breaks my heart, it surely has to, break the heart of God as well.
That's Carole Ardell, a recent Doctor of Ministry graduate, talking about her motivation for researching the relationship between trust and perceived relevance of the local church. She set out to understand how typical Canadians would respond if the Christian church were to reach out to its local community and say, "We can help, trust us." In today's episode, Rick and I talk with Carole about the findings and implications of her research on trust in the church. That clip you heard is just a small portion of her passion and heart for the gospel and how to effectively bring it to those who need it. Carole has helped plant 2 churches and continues to be invested in the work of the local church. We hope you're encouraged and challenged by our conversation. And don't forget to stick around at the end as Rick and I share our thoughts and impressions of the interview.
Carole, in your research, you set out to see if people trust churches, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit, why did you pick trust? There's so many other researchers that are interested in whether people like churches, whether they attend churches. Why was trust important for you?
It was important for me because it was a personal question for me about, do I trust God? When I was 19, my sister and her husband were both killed in a car accident, and God was always big enough for me, but he wasn't always close enough for me. And so I knew the competence of God. It was the character of God that I hadn't really wrapped my heart around, is probably the best way to say it. And so my research came out of that background about, if I can trust God in his character and his competence, then perhaps those that don't know him yet could also understand and trust a fuller picture of God, the one that I may have understood at 19.
Now, Carole, when we think about trust, I think I have a gut sense for what it means, but for your research, how did you define it? And then maybe to piggyback off of that, how do you measure trust?
Those are both great questions. I had read a book by Stephen Covey called The Speed of Trust. And I do understand that when people are doing their doctoral research, they don't pick up their theorist in an airport bookstore, but that's kind of what I did. And the reason I went with Stephen Covey's matrix of trust, because he defined it as character and competence. And the words in his matrix of how he measured trust under character are the intent, the integrity, the caring, honesty, transparency, fairness, authenticity. And then under competence, he used words like capability, results, skills, track record, knowledge, performance. And a lot of those phrases, to me, reflect the character of God. And so if I was going to measure trust and apply it to a ministry setting, those parallels were really important to me. And also those words are really accessible to anyone. And so I could frame my research questions based on those words and those terms without having to define a lot of what I was asking. So it was really user-friendly.
Okay. And so you set out to do your research. What was your thesis? What did you think you were going to find, or what were you testing?
Well, for me, it was really important to clarify at the beginning that I wasn't testing to see if the church was relevant in Canadian culture. And by relevant, it's really important for me to clarify. I'm not talking about trendy or fitting in with, the latest styles or fashion trends. Relevant for me is connected. I say it this way: perceived relevance is the belief that something is closely connected, mattering, making a difference, and missing when absent. And so when I talk about irrelevance, it's the state of being disconnected, making little or no contribution, missing in action, and no one notices. If we could start from that point. So I wasn't asking whether or not the church was connected or disconnected or relevant or irrelevant, because all the research that was done before me says that the church is becoming increasingly irrelevant in that definition in my lifetime. So in 50 years, we've been continually becoming less connected with our culture. The question for me was not, are we irrelevant as a church, but is trust connected to that irrelevance? And the research that I did, going into it, I thought, yes, the church isn't trusted, because that's been my firsthand experience with people that I know, that I'm in a relationship with. They don't trust the church. And I think this research would have been really, really different had I asked, are Christians trustworthy? Because that's a whole different answer. Because I think there's, 4 and 5-star Christians out there, killing it for the cause of Christ in their communities and living in a trustworthy manner that people that they know would say, yeah, of course I trust Christians because I know so-and-so and they're connected relationally to me. But my project was on the institution church. Do people who aren't part of the institutional church, do they trust the church?
And how much of the church in Canada did you study?
Well, not as much as I would have liked to. I sent out a survey. I didn't survey as much of the church in Canada as I would have liked to. 380 people participated in my research. And of those 380, 170 classified themselves as being outside the church, and they were my target audience. And I also, in my survey, narrowed my research down to Prince George, British Columbia, because that's where I happen to be living. And my research sample was taken with the snowball method. So I emailed my contacts the survey and said, only do it as an insider if you're going to send it to an outsider. And again, those two terms are important to clarify. When I talk about an insider, it's someone who in the previous 12 months attended an in-person church service 4 or more times. And then an outsider is someone who attended 0 to 3 times in the previous 12 months. And unfortunately, 6 of those months was during COVID, when many of the churches in BC were not even meeting. And so I allowed, in a 6-month window, someone to attend 4 times or more, which allowed for holidays, work schedules, and all those sorts of variables of why someone may not be there. But the fact is, the insider-outsider names apply to being inside of a building for a church service and has really nothing to do with their personal faith story. Because if later we get to the demographics and the description of the people who would call themselves an outsider, many of them would self-describe as privately faithful in terms of faith. They just aren't found in the building.
And what about your thesis? So you've kind of described your method and how you set things up. What was your thesis?
That there was a strong correlation between trust and perceived relevance. And when I put all my data together, the bivariate correlation showed a really good trend line going right through the middle of all the data points. And so there was a strong to moderately strong correlation between the two.
So what does that mean for the church then? How can the church respond to these findings? I mean, you said yourself, at least not based on trust, but on relevance, this has been something that has been researched before, and that it seems as though the institution of the church is losing relevance and connection with these outsiders. So what does trust add to the conversation, and how ought churches respond, or how can they respond?
One of the primary ways churches can respond to this is that recognizing that there is a difference between how people inside the church perceive the church and how outsiders perceive the church. And probably a question before that is, does that even matter what outsiders think of the church? Like, is that an important question or not? And that's something that I had to come to terms with. And I think it is important, because if the churches who bear the name of Christ represent Christ to those that don't know him yet. And so I think it matters to Christ how outsiders perceive his people and his body as an institution. My research findings weren't that just that outsiders trusted the church less than insiders do. It's that they didn't really trust the church at all, or they were undecided if they could trust the church. And I described this to my friend when I was telling her about the project. I grew up in a family home where there was my mom, my dad, and my older sister and me. And when my sister and I got to the age where we could date, the general rule in the house was that 3 out of the 4 members of our household had to approve the dating candidate to see if we would be allowed to go on a date with them. And so I said, after I did all my research, if an outsider was asking if they could date the church, they wouldn't get 3 out of 4 people saying, yeah, it's a good bet.
Wow.
And to me, that was sobering, because the gospel is a trustworthy message, and God himself has proven his character and his credibility. And yet, if we want to go and make disciples of all nations with a trustworthy gospel message, we need to be portrayed or perceived as trustworthy representatives of that message.
So in your research, Carole, you had some qualitative responses to your research as well.
Mm-hmm.
What were the kinds of things that outsiders were saying about the church? If you could even paraphrase, just to give us something more than sort of the number side of it.
Sure. When it came to whether the church was perceived as caring or honest, so this is the character part of trust, the scandals, the residential schools, they don't present or support their beliefs with integrity or honesty. They say one thing and act a different way. It's an event-driven model were some of the comments. So it's a program and not concerned about the people. The majority of funds that are raised benefit those that are inside and that have given the funds in the first place. When it comes to the competence of the church and the capabilities and the track record, they're supposed to be about love and inclusion, but they aren't. It's an exclusive club. As Jesus followers, they're really not great at following Jesus' example, was another one. They're judgmental. They take money out of the community rather than contributing to the well-being of the community.
And how did that contrast with what insiders were saying? Or were insiders saying similar things?
Insiders were aware of where the church has fallen short, but consistently were willing to give the church the benefit of the doubt. I've just moved to Calgary for a few months, and I've been trying to volunteer somewhere in the city, but I'm unknown. And I keep saying, but I know me, my references know me, just trust me. I don't need to do all the hoops and police checks and everything. Just let me help people while I'm here. But because I'm unknown, I'm untrusted. So there is a connection, I think. The fact that we're unknown to a large chunk of our culture, we're unconnected because we're unknown. But as some of the data said, that unknown doesn't necessarily mean distrust. But if there has been experience to cause distrust is the reason. Like a lot of the youngest generation in my research, so the 18 to 24-year-olds, they said the church is the least relevant to their age group, but they were the least jaded when it came to trust. And I think it's because they haven't had opportunity to be personally hurt, or they don't know people that have experienced anything firsthand to cause the distrust. And so my friend described it as, if I have no need to go to Home Depot is irrelevant to me, but I don't, distrust them. They're just unknown. And so I think the church is unknown to a large part of our society.
Do you have any recommendations for how the church can become known and build trust?
I do. And there's some churches during COVID that it did it really well. There's a church in the Lower Mainland. It's Peace Portal Alliance in Vancouver area. And during COVID, their church opened up as a homeless shelter because there was such a great need, especially in the winter months. And so rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, they said, who in our community can we partner with? And so there was already a shelter running. They just needed more beds. So they said, here, leverage our building and our resources and our volunteers who will look after cleaning. You do what you do really, really well, and you manage and run the shelter, but we're going to give our resources to serve our community in this way. They also hosted grad for the 2 years, so 1,500 students for the 2 years of grad during COVID. They just had to socially distance one student at a time walking across the platform. The staff was there to cheer them on, take pictures. And so it took forever to get through all those students, but it was a way of meeting a really practical need in their community. And I think part of the impression, like even with the CERB benefit, had churches said, we're not going to lay off staff and take advantage of the CERB payment from the government. We're going to continue paying our staff, even though we're not doing Sunday morning services anymore. How can we pay them to meet practical needs in our community? Even if it was visiting people outside of a door, like we know that the social needs are great, especially among seniors. Is there a way that we can just really transition our job description in a way that meets a need in the community? Other churches were already doing hampers, and they just upped their food delivery and giving. because of the needs that were expressed during COVID.
Carole, I'm always interested in how Canada has changed over the years. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on whether the church was more trusted in the past. And if it was, why was it more trusted? And how did the trust become eroded?
I do think it was more trusted. And I think the church, like in my lifetime, the church was really at the center of society. The majority of my friends went to church when I grew up in Toronto. And then in 50 years, the culture has moved because of the lack of connectedness. There was this division between social care and spiritual care or soul care. And that gap got wider and wider and wider. And as we focused on the soul and neglected or didn't allocate resources to social care, Salvation Army being the notable exception in Canada. But for the majority of evangelical churches, we focused on the spiritual side of life and neglected to invest in the social needs around us. And I think that's where the disconnect came. That's where I think the perceived lack of trust is or the irrelevance, because we don't see the churches actually contributing to the well-being of the neighborhood like other organizations are doing. And also with the Every Child Matters and with the Orange Shirt Day that started in BC, that has played a huge part in raising the awareness of the failings of the church in the past. And I think there's a tendency among churches to say, but that was then. We're not doing that now. But Covey has what he describes as a trust tax. And I think over the last 50 years, because we haven't been connected to society in a contributing way, that the trust tax from all these things that come into the media and that are now at the forefront of people's minds, the tax bill grows. And so we're not at a neutral trust point with our culture. We're in the negative numbers. We owe. And so we have to regain that lost ground before we can say we're trustworthy as an institution, because of all the backlog of all the past that really we had nothing to do with, but we need to take ownership.
And when you make the distinction between soul care and social care, did things change? Was there not as great a need for the church to do social care in the past that there is today? Or were we doing social care in the past and now we're not? Is it the case that the church sort of continued on doing what they were doing that worked for a time and now it doesn't work? Or did we stop doing something that we were doing before and now we don't do it?
I think in my experience and the denomination that I grew up in, we were really good at social care, but that was overseas. Somehow with the affluence maybe and the growth of the middle class, the needs weren't as visible. And so we just stopped looking for them. I think they were always there. They just weren't so obvious, perhaps. And because Salvation Army has been doing it consistently and they were been aware of the need for, decades. So they persisted in seeking out those needs and really embodying Isaiah 61, that where there's brokenness, we're going to bring healing in a very practical way because of the gospel.
You mentioned Salvation Army a few times, and then this church in BC that was really finding opportunities to serve their community. Did any of the outsiders in your surveys, did they mention any churches that they saw doing it right?
The one that was mentioned the most in the open text boxes was the Sikh or the Sikh community that is actively, visibly contributing to the needs. And most recently, just with the flooding in BC, to their credit, the evangelical churches as well jumped on meeting needs in a very public way, but they weren't the only religious group that was doing so. And I think part of it may be, if I'm allowed to say, our media may not highlight the good that churches do to the degree that they would highlight other organizations that also do good in the community. But the perception is the Christian church isn't as concerned about the needs around them as other religious groups may be.
And presumably, if the Christian churches were connected, they wouldn't need the media to highlight what they were doing.
Exactly, because they would be known locally and trusted locally. And all the literature research showed that people trust people they know more than the institutions, and people trust their neighbors more than people that they may have met that don't live near them. So the whole idea of a local parish And that approach is one that we may want to revisit and look and see who are the people, like it sounds very Sesame Street-ish, but who are the people in your neighborhood, the people that you meet when you're walking down the street. They're the ones that a natural connected relationship is possible and preferable than doing something on the other side of town with people that you won't actually interact with on a daily basis.
I'm just thinking about my own church, which I drive 20 minutes to get to. And then I think about the people on my street people that I meet when I'm walking down the street. And they're different groups of people. So if I do something with my church, I'm unlikely to meet the people on my street when I'm there. I hear a lot of writers talk about sort of returning to the parish model, but because we drive, we really don't live in parishes. How do we kind of reconcile that? Because I think just sort of the nature of our lives mean that we don't live in parishes, or our church is in another parish.
There is a move for some denominations that when staff gets hired, they have to live within a 5-kilometer radius of the church to focus on that more. And I have, friends who are both parents or working full-time jobs. And so for them, it's thinking of their work environment as their parish. And so it's not just the institution that has a parish, but we as individuals who are representatives of Christ. Because if we're spending 40 to 60 hours a week at work, that really is our parish. So how do we live in a trustworthy manner, being connected with those people, not just as co-workers, but as human beings who share the same joys and sorrows, griefs and, longings and desires for life? How do we embody the message in a trustworthy manner as individuals? But when it comes back to the institution, there's local schools connected in every church neighborhood, because that's how city planners in Canada have done it. There's land is allocated for schools and for religious institutions. And so to me, that's a natural place of connection that we can make a difference. And if the educational research is true, that kids need to learn by grade 3, in Prince George, there's schools that our kids are graduating from grade 6 that haven't met a grade 3, grade 4 reading level. So that's a really practical need. And if our church is positioned in a way that could help meet that need, that's actually adding value, just because this is the next generation. And I would call that as part of discipleship. Because if we think about when our approach to discipleship, when does that start? Does it start the minute that someone says, I'm a follower of Jesus? Or does it start when we take an interest and focus our attention on God and focus our attention on those around us? Is that how we're going to define discipleship? Because to me, if we limit discipleship until someone's in the building, then we've lost so many of our parish connections simply because we're waiting for them to come inside of a building.
In your thesis, which was great, toward the end, at one point, I think you said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there have been books written about this problem for the last 30 years. People should just read those books and do what it says. And so why don't you think, I think everybody wants people to trust us. They would like to see their churches trusted. And it seems that there are prescriptions out there for how you can do that. Why do you think there's such apparent inertia?
I think it's partly because we still think we're doing better than we are. Because I trust the people that I'm sitting with in my church building every Sunday morning. I know the good that we're doing. I know that our motives are pure. And it's the whether or not someone outside, if their opinion matters. And I think until we realize that if it doesn't matter, is that the same as asking, do those people matter? In order for someone to trust me, they need to know me, but that also implies that I need to know them. And if I'm not committed to doing what it takes to get to know people who don't trust the church, then I'm content to just live in my insider world and exist and continue to be pushed to the fringes of Canadian culture, really. And so I think it's a heart check for us as insiders and an awareness that Jesus didn't come for us as a church. He came for the world. And so if I'm not prepared to follow Jesus to where he already is working, then perhaps I'm not willing to follow Jesus.
You had sampled Prince George. How do you know that this is something that applies to Canada more broadly?
What I think does apply is the gap between how insiders and outsiders view the local church. Because insiders, no matter where they're located, will always have that confirmation bias. They'll always see their church through their own lens. And outsiders consistently won't have that same perspective on the church. And so I think if not the actual, data points will be the same, that the gap between how outsiders and insiders view the church, that gap will always be there simply because insiders see it as insiders.
So if I'm an insider and I don't have an accurate picture of what my neighbors think of the church, what the outsiders think, how do I go about getting a fair assessment of what I'm really like?
That's a great question. And some of my friends from the same church that I'm part of, when they took this survey to their neighbors, they said it was the best conversation because now they had a tool and said, I got to help my friend. She's doing this research. Can you tell me what you think of the churches in our city that, wear the name of Christ in their name or that represent Christ to the city? And for them, it was a brilliant, door opening conversation to hear and to ask the question. I think another way would be, rather than finding out or asking the question, what do my neighbors think about our church, would be get to know them and just start changing to say, I'm going to go change their impression of our church by living in relationship with them. So really not worrying where they are on the scale of trust, distrust, just start being in relationship with them and becoming known as a Christ follower in a very, loving, kind, wise way, and just start changing opinions one by one without having to plot them on a graph and say where they are in terms of trust and distrust. Just start being relevant in their life, which means connected.
Sounds like some really good advice. Carole, as we wrap up, if people wanted to sort of follow up and learn more about your research, how could they get in touch with you, or how could they get their hands on a copy of your thesis so that they can get some ideas about how they do these assessments with their own communities, maybe how they would approach learning more about their outsiders in their community so that they can build trust?
Well, you can email me. You can call me. I can send you my dissertation. It's also going to be published on ProQuest in the next few weeks. And I would love to talk about this because I believe it matters to God what people think of his church. And if Christ died for it, then I think it's important enough to have a conversation. So I will make time, anytime, anywhere to discuss this. I'd be happy to do that.
Well, Carole, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've always been invested in the church, and it's nice to be invited to a conversation about it as well. So thank you.
When we were talking with Carole in the interview, she had mentioned that there were decades worth of literature that supported her thesis. I think what strikes me about her research is that it doesn't seem all that surprising. It seems intuitive. And so I think maybe she measured what a lot of us have already been perceiving for a while. And so I don't know. I guess it seems like, how do we turn this ship around? Or I remember being quite young and excited about what the church could be and what the church could do. And I had a lot of older Christians in my life say things like, well, it's hard to turn the Titanic around. And I'm not sure if they used Titanic strategically because they were actually thinking that the church was a sinking ship. But it was really discouraging to hear as a young person. I wonder if there is sort of this defeatist attitude that is prevalent in the church that kind of leads to apathy about the possibilities of engaging with outsiders well, if they think that the culture is too far gone and these people are just not going to engage. Or if we have a really narrow idea of what it means to disciple, like she was saying, then maybe that is cutting us off at the feet and really limiting the scope of opportunities out there in building trust and connection with our communities.
I was really struck by what she made a distinction between the institution of the church and Christians. And sometimes I wonder, when we're talking about the church is an institution, but it's also Christ's body. And those two can be the same thing. But sometimes I wonder if we've had kind of a notion of what the institution of the church is, and that hasn't kind of culturally changed. That we've had kind of an institutional model and structure for the church that was good for a particular time. And now we're kind of preserving that institution, model, and structure, and it simply doesn't work anymore. Because, the church as the body of Christ is all those Christians that may be really shining Christ's love, but then we come together and are we trying to preserve some kind of a structure, I guess, that doesn't work for our time? And, we may change and find something that does work for our time, and I'm sure that 50 years later, that won't work for the time 50 years later either.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's because of some of the work that we've been doing in sphere sovereignty. Just with another project, we've been encountering some people who hold to this reformed model of sphere sovereignty, which is that the church and the family and society kind of have these distinct spheres of responsibility. And when she mentioned that idea of soul care and social care and how the church has really divided those two and tended to focus more on soul care, I could think of a lot of societal institutions that have maybe taken over the social care that the church would have historically overseen. And so I wonder if the church felt pushed out of that, or we're just going to let those people who are gifted and equipped to really take care of some of these social needs, we'll let them do that, and we'll kind of stay in our lane, taking care of the soul. I wonder what sort of societal and cultural moves have led or contributed to that division. And it's probably not just this decision or indifference on the church's part.
I'm always interested in why things worked in the past and they don't work now. I'm always interested in thinking about what is it about the past that we may cling to today, even when we recognize that things aren't working. I guess Carole's thesis just left me thinking about that question. Why is it when we have so much data that what we're doing currently isn't working, that we're still so reluctant to change? And that's something I'm going to be thinking about over the next weeks.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.